Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to welcome you to NAPCAN's National Child Protection Week webinar series. My name is Libby Payne and I'll be your facilitator for today. The panel is Let's Hear from Young People, What's Missing from Education on Relationships, Sex and Consent. So alongside myself, we have the incredible panelists in the room with us today. We have Ruben Sheriff, Oliver White and Chanel Contos joining us today, and we're super grateful to have everyone in the space today. We are going to introduce everyone really quickly, but I just want to pass to Ruben Sheriff first, a proud Pakana man who's going to be doing our acknowledgement to country today.
Yeah, thanks, Libby. Welcome to the webinar, everybody. As you just heard, my name is Ruben, and I've been invited to begin today's webinar with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to start by paying deep, deep respect to the traditional owners of the land upon which I sit and speak with you all today, the Muwinina people. The Muwinina cared for this country, and this country cared for them, a reciprocal relationship and understanding dating back to millennia. Unfortunately, no Muwinina survived invasion. They lived, loved and laughed on this land as the kind, caring, happy and healthy people they were. Now they dance in sky country above those of us here in Nipaluna with our ancestors. I'd like to extend this acknowledgement to the Pakana Palawa peoples of Lutruwita Trawana, my community, who continue to care for this country, guided by the fire, passion, black strength and knowledges of our old people, beside us and within us always. We do this in memory of the Muwinina and hope that they are up in sky country smiling as they once did here, proud of how their country is being cared for. I'd also like to pay my respect to past Muwinina elders and the past and present elders of the Pakana Palawa community. Muwinina spirit lives on in our hearts and through this country, their country, forever. In saying this, I'd like to also acknowledge any First Nations peoples who are joining us today. As Indigenous folk, the connection we have to country is unbreakable. We are country and country is us, and I pay respect to that connection you share with your land. I also recognise that as we are an online panel today, we have speakers and guests spanning across many long strides and waterways. We have panellists today presenting from different places, Libby on Darkinjung land and Chanel and Ollie on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge again with deep respect the past and present elders of these communities and the lands and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities of which you all join us from today, which to have you join us, we are so grateful for. And with that, I'll hand back to you now, Libby. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. Thanks for that heartfelt acknowledgement. I just want to kick off with a bit of housekeeping. So many of you might not be familiar with GoToWebinars. So the control panel for you is on the right-hand side. I realize I'm gesturing to the wrong side that's on your screen, but on the right-hand side, if you run into any technical issues, NAPCAN team will pop their contact details in the chat function for you. At the control panel at the bottom, you will see a question function. So there are lots of you online today. We'd love those questions coming through and then we'll filter them out. And then at the end, we'll pick some ones because there's lots of you and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. We probably won't have time for all of them, but please enter them at any point throughout the discussion and I will try and remind people. We will have handouts and links that we mention from our conversation today that we posted in the chat, and this webinar will be recorded for those that aren't able to make it, and they will be posted with the resource list on NAPCAN's website when it's ready. So we are here today as part of National Child Protection Week, and this year's theme is Where We Start Matters, and I think that pertains really well to the conversation we're going to have today around relationships education and consent education, that if we provide the right tools to young people, they will be able to have successful and respectful and healthy relationships moving forward, but that needs to be done right, and young people need to be involved in that conversation in order to set people up for where they start and make sure that that matters moving forward. A content note, we are going to be talking about some sensitive content today. It might be difficult or upsetting. We are in the space talking about consent, so in that implies perhaps conversations where there is a lack of consent as well. So please look after yourself. It's okay to switch off or step away from the webinar. There will be some notes in the chat as well of some services and helplines that are available. So let's get into it. I'm so excited for everyone to introduce themselves and to start the discussion. I will introduce myself first as a facilitator. So I'm Libby Payne, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a respectful relationships and consent educator on the Central Coast of New South Wales, so on Dark and Junk country. I'm a facilitator with Coast Shelter, and I deliver NAPCAN's Love Bites program to over 2,000 students thus far. I've been in the youth advocacy space for about 5 years now, and I'm currently working with the E-Safety Commissioner, Full Stop Australia, and Plan International. So as a queer woman and a survivor of image-based abuse, I am really passionate about using lived expertise, both in those areas and as a young person, in order to create change. I've got a Bachelor of Social Science with majors in Gender Studies and Anthropology, and I've recently taken up community gardening. So that's my fun fact. I do love a good garden. And one thing that I really want people to take away from today is that when it comes to young people, when it comes to issues that impact young people, do nothing about us without us. Always include us in that conversation, always consult us, because you will get better outcomes that way. So I'll pass over to the panel. If you could do your name, your pronouns, the land you're on, a bit about you, and what is one thing you want people to take away from today. So I will start with Oliver White. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Libby. Hi, everyone. I'm Oliver White. My pronouns are he, him, and as Ruben said, I'm on beautiful Gadigal land here today. And my role is chair of NAPCAN Youth Speak Out Council. So in that role, I kind of connect NAPCAN and about 17 young people from every state and territory in Australia to inform the work that NAPCAN's doing, particularly around their Love Bites program. I'm also kind of the key point where other organisations, if they wish to get consultation from young people on their work, can contact me. So it's an awesome role and I really enjoy it. At the moment, I'm currently studying at Sydney Uni, doing a double major, one of which is a criminology degree, which I'm heavily interested in. Thanks, Libby.
Awesome. Thank you, Oliver. I'll pass over to Ruben. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Libby. So my name's Ruben, and as was stated before, I'm a proud Pakeha man living in Lutruwita, Tasmania, on Moana country. My pronouns are he, him. I also quite like he, they, and they, them pronouns. I'm not too fussed. I'm a youth advisor for NAPCAN through the NAPCAN Youth Speak Out Council, NISO, and have been with NISO since April of this year. I also study a Bachelor of Social Work at the University of Tasmania with interest in postgrad research, and have just started a research assistant role with the university working in the mental health space. My main interests and passions are in the accessibility of eating disorder treatment, sexology, youth justice, and First Nations advocacy. I'm really excited to have a yarn with you all today and to hear what our other amazing panelists have to say. And I guess what I'd like people to learn and take away from today is that even though things seem to be progressing and changing at a really fast rate, we still have a pretty long way to go in providing adequate and comprehensive sex, consent, and respectful relationships education for the young people of this nation. So yeah, thanks, Libby.
Thanks, Ruben. Thanks so much. Chanel, last but certainly not least, can you introduce yourself to everyone, please?
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I'm so excited to be speaking on this panel with so many incredible people, some of which are my friends, which is really nice. So my name is Chanel Contos. My pronouns are she, her. I'm tuning in today from Gadigal land. Thank you, Ruben, for your really beautiful acknowledgement of country there. But I also spend half my time living in London. I'd also like to pledge my yes vote to the upcoming referendum while we're on that topic. Bit about me. So I founded the Teachers Consent Campaign, which was a grassroots movement that demanded that consent education was mandated in the Australian curriculum. The petition got almost 50,000 signatures and almost 7,000 people posted their testimonies of sexual assault during the Australian school system on my website, Teachers Consent. And as a result, the Australian government mandated consent education from kindergarten until year 10, which is very exciting and massive. And Teachers Consent's just been given $3.5 million of government funding to create social media resources so that we can continue the education that young people are receiving beyond the age of year 10 and ensuring that the messaging is coming across on their screens as well as what they're learning in the classroom. I'm also the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership Global Youth Committee, and I sit on a few federal government panels about consent campaigns and the implementation of consent education. And also, shameless plug, but I have a book coming out on Tuesday, which I'm really excited about. So that's also my fun fact, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, everyone, I'll say it now and I'll say it again at the end. Go buy Chanel's book. It comes out on the 12th. Consent Laid Bare. It's going to be amazing. So I'm sure we'll chat more about some of that as we go through. But I want to start our questions today by acknowledging that we are young people on a panel for Child Protection Week. And I think it's also amazing, but also should be the standard that when we're talking about issues that impact young people are consulted and they are in the room and they do have a voice. But this is actually kind of a new concept to consult young people. So I would like for us to lay for the audience, why is it important to have young people? What do young people add to this conversation as opposed to, I guess, experts later in their career that have studied this? So Ollie, I'd love to pass to you first if you'd like to chat.
Yeah, thanks, Libby. I kind of like to say that it's a bit of a no-brainer because it does seem like that, but I suppose that's not a super great takeaway comment for a webinar. The thing is, though, when we speak about like sex ed, consent, respectful relationships, child maltreatment in the context of prevention, the one standing common denominator amongst all of those things is the children and young people. So I think that in and of itself is a really valuable takeaway. I mean, like if you have a friend who's feeling sad or upset, your first boat of call is not going to be go to a psychologist or go to an academic. You're going to ask your friend, how can I best help you? How can I best support you? What's making you feel this way? So it seems like, if we're going to be talking about child maltreatment, we should be doing that. The ACMS study has shown us that Australia has an incredible amount of sexual violence, emotional abuse, physical abuse going on. So I suppose we as young people, we know what's going to best engage us, and we know what's going to best engage our friends and our peers. So if we have sex ed programs run through schools, or if we're sitting in on a webinar like this, we are going to pick it apart. We're going to know the flaws. We're going to pick up on wording and have people frame things. Are we included in this conversation? Can we see ourselves, or are we missing? So I think for us as young people, it's really important that we're included if we're the target audience. But I also think particularly for academics in the space, it's good for them because it's going to improve their work and the value of their work. I think it's almost easy to just consider the quantitative data when doing research or building a project and forget about the qualitative data and how much value that brings, and that there is a life and a lived experience behind a statistic. I want to make clear, though, that involving young people in the conversation versus genuinely valuing and listening to our voices and our opinions are two different things. I've sat in on a few consultations where people jump into defense mode when you kind of tweak their work or say, hey, I don't think this is going to be engaging for young people. But I've also sat in on many consultations with young people where you can see the academic or the person doing the work is really interested and wants to engage the young people and will adjust their work accordingly to the advice that they receive. But I think Chanel, because she's also the chair of a council, but also you, Libby, because you work with young people quite regularly, can speak to that question really well too. So.
Chanel, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add to that. I agree with everything Ollie said, and I think that when we're thinking about like policies, legislation, change, rules, methods, whatever we're doing, it consistently needs to be an intersection of young people's voices and experts in the space, and that overlap in the middle there, I think, is where we can create ideas or methods or ways to go about things that really can make change. I think, as Ollie said, it is a no-brainer that young people should be involved in conversations about things that affect young people. However, I also think the way that the world has evolved and how quickly things change for different generations means that unless we're directly speaking to people who are directly impacted by these things, then we're never going to be able to make adequate measures to protect them. So, like, for example, Libby, you mentioned image-based abuse before. That was not as widespread or prevalent or understood in the way that image-based abuse is experienced for young people now is not at all relevant to people who were, pretty much above like the age of 50 when they were young, at least. The way that young people have phones now, the different types of abuse and messaging and things that they're exposed to are just radically different. Also, just in terms of trends and themes, I even notice when I go and speak at schools sometimes, or when I have focus groups with young people, sometimes I'm speaking to 15-year-olds and their experience of things is completely different to mine, which makes complete sense because I'm now 10 years past that. So even though in the government's eyes or, in like official terms, I'm still classified a young person or a young adult, we need to be speaking to young people to understand what they can actually handle in terms of their conversations, what's actually happening to them, and make sure that we can step up and meet them where they are. Because I also think that young people are consistently underestimated by adults in lots of ways in terms of what we think they can handle talking about and in terms of what we think they're able to do in terms of contributing to conversations.
Fantastic, thank you. Ruben, did you want to add anything to that? I've got my own thoughts, but I want to give you a chance first.
Just a little bit. I agree with both of what you just said. I think that was really great, but I just want to reinforce that I think it's really important to include young people in these conversations because otherwise, as Chanel said, we have this group of experts who, despite meaning well, don't have living knowledges of what it's like to be a young person in modern Australia. We're here for National Child Protection Week. We need to be incorporating and listening to voices on the ground. So as our advice and our programs and these knowledges suit them and align with them, because just otherwise it feels like we're completely missing the point, and unfortunately on the hierarchy of knowledge, the knowledges of children and young people is often at the bottom rung, but there is such value in listening to our young people, in listening to the people who are affected by the decisions we're going to be making. And I just really want to reinforce what you said before, Libby, nothing about us without us. It's just really important to be engaging with young people at all steps of the process. And, through NAPCAN, for example, we've seen how great that can be and how valuable that can be.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think Chanel's point about listening versus I think Ollie, it was versus meaningful action is completely different. Sometimes people are happy to listen, but don't want to do anything with that. But I think we can see the value of lived expertise or lived experience in particularly the sexual violence space. People are honouring the fact that if you've lived through domestic or sexual violence, you have something to add to making sure services can act better, can policy change can be made. And I think we're seeing that again, slight rise in youth being experts in their lived experience. Because as everyone said, no one's lived through the same childhoods we have with phones and stuff like that. And again, as Chanel said, we are a lot older than young people that are just entering high school as well today. So we need to make sure that we are constantly passing the baton to the people that are below us and inviting them and making space for them to join the conversation. I think that the idea of having peer-led spaces is really fantastic. The amazing part of Love Bites is when we deliver in the classroom as well. It's not me standing at the top of the classroom saying, this is what you need to know. It's, okay, here's a question, discuss with each other. Where's your line? What do you think? And educating each other, because that peer-led engagement is super important as well, because young people don't always want to be told that by older people, especially when that seems quite out of touch. But linking to lived experience, I want to know, what was your sex ed like? A lot of people listening today, it may have been a while since you received sex education, formal sex education, or be that through your families. Some people probably did not get it at all. Some people in this space here in our conversation may not have got it at all. I want to see, has it changed? Maybe our experiences are different from the people listening in today. But Ruben, as our most recent graduate, I'd love to throw to you. What would you like to share on that? What was your sex ed like?
Yeah, so I have quite a few thoughts. Thanks, Livy. So I graduated high school in 2019, and high school in Lutruwita, Tasmania finishes in year 10. So not that long ago. But my sex and respectful relationships education, overall wasn't really the best in my opinion. In later primary school, to my memory, we actually did have a really cool lady come and talk to us about different parts of the body, sex, and the changes that would happen to us as we entered puberty. And that was really helpful at that time. It made the conversation around sex and puberty a lot less daunting as kids and a lot more open, which was really helpful. And then something changed when I got to high school. We had new educators come in from a different organisation, and this shift is probably why I'd say that overall the sex education and respectful relationships education that I received in high school wasn't the best. Our programs were completely founded in fear and pregnancy prevention. They were just totally fear-based. I remember one time, for example, we played Pass the Parcel Contraceptive Edition, and I opened the wrapping paper to a wooden heart, and our facilitator went on a 10-minute tangent about how abstinence was the only way we could all stay infection-free and prevent pregnancy. They also discouraged us from having multiple sexual partners, as this meant to them that we were sleeping with everybody they had slept with and everybody those people had slept with, and so on and so forth, like big tree diagrams on the whiteboard. This is problematic for so many reasons. It was really lacking. We were told to abstain from sex so as to prevent infection, rather than being able to have an open and destigmatized discussion about what to do if we suspected infection and the resources we could access if that was the case. We were made to fear sex rather than view sex as a source of pleasure or connection or even just fun. The education we received was totally cisgender and heterosexually orientated too. And as a queer kid, at the time I felt totally left out of the picture. Even in the late 2010s, the educators didn't really know how to answer questions about queer sex. And in fact, the kids who asked questions about queer sex, I'd say, were considered radical in the classroom. And as for addressing consent and respect for relationships education, I'd actually say I didn't receive consent or respect for relationships education whatsoever. It was bare to none. And the knowledge that I had about respect for relationships and consent after leaving high school was not gained through the education I received at school. My peers and I would walk out of those sessions in shock and kind of angry that we weren't being given access to the knowledges we knew we deserved at school. And this is so dangerous. We know that kids want to learn about consent. We know young people are having sex. Let's not deny them this right to knowledge and the essential resources we owe them as they grow so that they can stay safe, so that we can keep them safe. It just wasn't a great experience. But while this experience is bad, I do acknowledge that there are some pretty amazing things happening in the space. We have advocates such as Chanel and also the Love Bites program, which Libby, Ollie and myself are all involved with at different levels, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about a little bit more later, but I didn't have access to those programs. It left for a really lacking, dangerous and unsafe experience for myself, my peers, and the kids that came before and after us. So thanks, Libby.
Thank you. It's always like, even though I've heard stories like that time and time again, every time I'm still like, really, really. Ollie or Chanel, I don't mind, whoever would like to jump in next.
I know, Chanel, you're going to be so keen to jump in.
I am. I'm sorry. I was laughing about the wooden heart. I know I shouldn't laugh, but it's just so funny, isn't it? But it's also horrible. It's.
I was thinking it's so ridiculous. It's hard not to laugh.
Who thought that was a good idea when they were planning this?
It also just sounds like a lot of purity culture. And I know, Chanel, you can speak to that so well, better than I can. but my experience was very similar to Ruben's, like next to none, but anything that was, it was maybe like the T video, but just that. There was nothing following that. It was like, this is your consent 101, as if that was a great explainer. Like, good video, follow it up with some great conversation, right? Like, don't just show us that and that's it. And same with Ruben, like around the lack of like the LGBTIQA plus experience. Like, you know, it's dangerous not to have that, because you leave kids leaving school with this idea that if you have queer sex, you're going to get HIV, which leads to AIDS, and die from all of those fear-mongering ads that were done, you know, like a generation before. It's like, yeah, it's disappointing that, like Ruben said, that we're not given access to those kind of things. And because they are such a key preventative measure that we can use to reduce, you know, sexual assault, rape culture, so many things, it's education, and it's not a big ask, and it seems like a big ask because it's still not there, you know, it's still not at the level it needs to be. But Chanel, you can speak to this probably a lot better than I can.
No, you're great. I've got so much in like the back of my mind to say, but I guess so. The first time I ever heard about sex at school was when I was in primary school, and someone spray painted on the back of the bathroom blocks in giant letters saying sex is fun, and it obviously started like all these whispers all across the school. And that was the first and the only time in my school experience that it was ever taught to me that sex was meant to be a pleasurable experience. And it took me a really, really, really long time to like think back on that and like what the implications of that were. So sex ed, I mean, I remember when we were in year 6 or year 5 having a really great external speaker come in and speak to us about periods, which was really great because it destigmatized the whole topic for the whole grade. I went to a single sex school. And I think, again, the key thing there was the destigmatization of the topic, because I think the girls who had already gotten that period felt like a massive weight had been lifted off their shoulders now that everyone in the grade had this sort of like language of being taught that it was normal, and everyone kind of like knew it was okay, and then suddenly it kind of became a thing that we would celebrate amongst our friend groups. And I think this idea of stigma and shame is really interesting as well, because I think that plays so much into conversations about consent and sexual assault, which, I mean, like that does feel obvious, that when we have shame around it, it means that victims have a greater taboo of speaking up. And this sounds a bit like silly because obviously I know this, but in the last 2 weeks, 2 books I've read are Maya Angelou's autobiography, the first one, where she was a victim of child sexual abuse in it, and Testaments by Margaret Atwood. And in both of them, the main characters describe their sexual assault experience, child sexual abuse experience, and the shame that they feel around it because of the way that this conversation was spoken to them. They're so young that they don't know what sex is. No one has ever spoken to them in an adult way about sex. It's being called it, or getting it, or doing it, or whatever this thing is. And they think they've done something wrong. They think they've failed in getting this wooden heart, or like whatever the metaphor is on that. And I think we don't realize how much we're endangering our children when we put shame around topics like this, and how much we're disempowering them by refusing to give them language, by having these conversations with them, when the reality is that, I don't know about everyone on the call, but I don't remember not knowing what sex was. I always knew it was a thing. I didn't understand it. I didn't have a comprehensive like in any way, shape, or form. But I think we really do need to remove taboo around the topic and start having these conversations in a productive way instead. And then, yeah, my form of consent education came in year 10. And at the time, I thought it was like one of the most incredible days of school I'd had, and one of the most valuable lessons I've had at school. But it was basically a time where me and all my peers had a shared realization that a lot of us had been sexually assaulted, because suddenly consent was defined to us. And as Libby said before, when we talk about consent, by default, these other conversations come up, which meant that we were taught it way too late. And when we went to a trusted teacher and told them that it should be in the curriculum earlier, we were told that we were mature for the year and it wasn't applicable to other people and it would be stressful for them to hear about these things. So essentially victim blamed and said that they would rather us have uncomfortable experiences than put other people through conversations that may be uncomfortable for them. So I think in this whole conversation, and again, speaking to the fact that children can actually handle a lot more than we think they can handle, and they're actually having a lot of these conversations amongst their friends in a probably unsafe and misinformed way. Understanding that ultimately it is much better to have an uncomfortable conversation than it is to have an uncomfortable experience.
I'll just jump in here because I think I would like to follow Chanel's point about kids just having this conversation amongst themselves and not being informed, because we can think about where are kids getting this information from that they're all talking about. Porn. Okay, we know that porn's not a healthy way to view a sexual interaction, and it's also not an accurate one. So kids are having these conversations and they're misinformed, or they've gone and had a sexual experience themselves that might not have been consensual, that might not have been like good, and then they're sharing that with their peers, and so then it just leads to this catalyst effect of this is the norm, this is how we should be engaging in sex, this is how we should be treating one another. There's no base level of, no, this is what a respectful relationship is, and this is how to engage in consent in a healthy and constructive way.
Also, just to add to that, I think there are estimates in Australia that the average age that students access pornography for the first time is 11 years old, which is nuts. And again, talks to the fact that we need to be speaking to young people more and more about this, because as a 25-year-old who grew up with a shared home computer, that, like, I don't think that was the case for my generation, but it is the case for the younger generation. And the vast majority of the time, that is accidental access to pornography, but that doesn't mean that that pornography hasn't been viewed. And again, if there's shame around that and they can't tell their parents they've seen those sort of things and they're confused about that sort of messaging, or they, search further in order to figure out what they're trying to figure out themselves without help, or speak to their friends or older siblings or people on the bus or whatever it is. Yeah, thanks Ollie for bringing that up, because I think that is a massive defining feature of young people's experience with sex and relationships, the fact that our sexual landscape is being shaped increasingly by a dominating force that is pornography, that is more often than not quite violent and degrading towards women and other marginalized identities.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for that. I think like the overarching theme I can hear from that is just shame. Like there's just shame in every single conversation. And yeah, I know for myself, I think it must have been maybe year 3 or year 4, and we were talking about body parts, and somehow I think it must have been in conversations with my mother that people have body parts that could be intersex. I don't think I had the term for that in my head at that point. And I remember being like, oh yeah, but then some people can be born with like a clitoris and then like this as well. And then the teacher was like, no, not today, we're not having that. Like it was just shut down, and I had completely blanked this memory from my mind. But then one of my friends said, it was like, oh yeah, you were the kid that tried to like bring up sex in like year 4, and like we weren't even having that discussion then. And I was like, no, it was actually like about different bodies. And now I go into high schools and, we're in year 7 and 8, we're talking about LGBTQIA+, and the I comes up and these kids' minds are blown. It's like new thing, new concept, intersex people exist. By the way, it's 3% of the population, the same amount of people that have red hair and the same amount of people that have green eyes. Not the same people, obviously, but like it's huge percentage of our population, and it's just erased from the entire conversation. Which I think is a real shame. And shutting those conversations down again is like makes that place so unsafe for young people who that's their lived experience with their body. So I remember like that was the start of that. And then you've talked already about some of the impacts of not getting that good education. I went to a co-ed primary school and a co-ed high school, so I feel like my experience is quite different to some of these. Like we did get the STIs, pregnancy, all of that sort of stuff. We did talk about domestic violence. I don't specifically remember consent, but it was kind of like, okay, well, when there's a lack of this is what it looks like. But at no point there was it's about pleasure. It's meant to be fun. People, you know, want to enjoy it. Like queer sex ed was like completely erased. And like I think boys got talk about masturbation, but when our classes were split up, that happened, and then we didn't get any of that. But then the impacts of that, like we've talked before about the impact of young people. Okay, well then they piece together stories from their friends. It's like, what have I learned from this friend? What have I learned from this friend and from their own experiences? But I remember sitting in gender studies lectures in university, and the lecturer asked us, you know, what are some myths you've learned? And some people were still like, oh yeah, you guys get blue balls. You know, you can't take the emergency contraceptive pill more than like this amount of times, and you can't get pregnant on your period. Like so many false things because they just had not received that education. So we're not only like disservicing our like really young people in primary school, but when we know that it's 275 people experience sexual assault in a university context each week, like that is our statistics that we have. From the National Safety Survey, we know that it's impacting our university sector just as much as it's impacting our primary school. So talking about impact, and I know we've already started, what is the impact of a lack of sex education or sex education that's not informed by young people? Chanel, I thought you probably can speak to this with the testimonies that you've collected, and then whoever wants to jump in after that, that'd be great.
So, I mean, I think the most obvious impact is unhealthy and unsafe sexual relationships between young people. I mean, if we're thinking of like the largest manifestations of them, we have sexual assault and rape, we have unwanted pregnancies, and STI transmission, unwanted, if people aren't using protection or have adequate education or access to healthcare on all these things. But I think those kind of sound like the, big classic fear tactic things. But if we go a bit more just to the normal everyday experiences, what this does to the subconscious of people. So I think we've all mentioned here there was no conversation around pleasure in sex. And I think that mainly due to pornography and pervading this in young people, the idea of male sexual pleasure is quite like inherent and obvious to a lot of us. However, I think the extreme omission of female sexuality and female pleasure from a lot of these conversations, from pornography as well, from parents, from teachers, from peers. Like I'm pretty sure the clitoris was removed from our biology diagrams. Like that's the sort of like, apparently it's like an irrelevant body part. And what that does on a really simple level is it makes it hard for young people to distinguish between consensual and non-consensual sexual situations when there's never been a conversation about the fact that it is meant to be an enjoyable experience. And I mean, I don't know about you, Libby, but for me, it was literally the opposite. It was that sex is something that is meant to hurt, it's something we're meant to avoid, like something that, the first time you have sex with someone, you're bound to them for life if you're a woman, but the same doesn't apply for men. So, pick wisely, like all these sort of things. And something I kind of get consistently through people reporting to me their sex education experiences is very much, both Ruben and Ollie mentioned this idea of purity culture. And like the fact that, you're not meant to have sex with many people because apparently it's a dirty thing, it's a bad thing. Where lots of these kind of like ways teachers teach these sort of things is the one I've heard a few times is getting a piece of sticky tape and putting it around the classroom and the teacher showing that the sticky tape gets less sticky and picks up dirt along the way, and like that is meant to be a symbol of like your self-worth or like yourself or like whatever, your ability for people to love you and to like love other people. And I think this idea of sex as an act of capitulation, where I'm speaking now in a heterosexual framework, but that is how I was taught sex ed, is that it is something that a man conquers from a woman, and that it is something we should try not to like give into them or give them kind of just by default ruins any. The impact of that means that in a much broader societal way, it gets rid of any sort of equality or even power in that space. And I think that pervades like quite heavily into just like casual dating, into friendships, into sexual situations, even if they are consensual. It does blur this line of like what is consent, if it's something that is expected of us.
Yeah, I agree. Like to Chanel's point, I think we need to shift this paradigm that men are just constantly seeking sex and women don't ever want it. Like this, and to Chanel's point, you know, if you're a woman and you sleep with more than one person, then suddenly you've got this slut shaming name that is also shame driven and like a horrible experience, and like leads to bullying and other like catalyst events that, you know, impact you on into your future. And then, you know, these us as kids, where we are the future, and you know, you've got to be considering all of the trauma that comes with growing up and not having this affirmative consent education that is vital. But yeah, just to that point of just shifting that paradigm of men want sex all the time and that women don't.
Also,
Chanel.
just want to expand that idea. I think is very pervasive, especially amongst young people, especially amongst the way that I think like often adults like speak to young people about sex and relationships. But what that also does is it creates extra layers of taboo for men who are victims of child sexual abuse or of peer on peer sexual abuse or of any form of sexual assault, because it's very much like this rape myth of like, oh, you know, you should want it. If you're a real man, you would want it. Like, why would you say no? That sort of thing. And I think we really, I see it so much. Men who describe to me acts that are overtly sexual assault and refuse to even go anywhere near calling it that, because they're like, oh no, it's fine, she was hot, and are kind of like succumbing into those things themselves because it feels too confronting to confront all those stereotypes, all those expectations, and the fact that that happened all at the same time.
I'd also like to say that like this message that we're sending our kids, and that, you know, we are teaching our kids this message, we're actively disempowering them. You know, I think back to my time in high school, and the narrative around boys who had sex and girls who had sex, obviously in a heterosexual framework, was totally different. You know, the boys who had heterosex, those actions and bragging about those actions were kind of seen as validators of their masculinity and departures from boyhood into manhood. Whereas the girls who had sex, those conversations were really private and secret. And if they got out, the girls at my school were slut shamed and they were called names and they were seen as dirty and less valuable. Whereas for the boys, you know, the boys who had sex kind of wore it like a medal rather than wearing it as something of shame. And I just think it's really dangerous, because then we have these young people who go to college and then they might go to university or the workforce, and then they enter, you know, another workforce, and they're spreading this message, and then they'll have kids and they'll spread this message. And so if we stop this message being sent early and we empower our kids with knowledge and safety, we can do such amazing things for the future of this country.
I also think, sorry, last thing I'll say on this, I don't mean to hog this question, but what you said about it's almost as if wearing it like a medal, I think we can't discount the societal pressures that young boys and men face to engage in sex because of all these things, even if they're not ready. Very commonly I hear that young men have their first sexual experience usually quite early, and then not again for ages, because they feel as though that social pressure has been finally relieved off them. And then they wait a while until they actually start engaging in sex the way they actually want to. But what happens is that social pressure gets put on a person, and then that person relieves that social pressure by putting that pressure on another person who's usually a young girl. And that is how so many instances of peer-on-peer sexual assault, child sexual abuse occur, and they are extremely preventable. Extremely preventable.
Absolutely, the concept of toxic masculinity, and I think we're all accountable as a society in, reducing this toxic masculinity. It's, we do it to ourselves as men, but we also have it around us every day, all day, this expectation to be a certain way. And Chanel, you described it super well, like this expectation, this pressure on someone, and then they're looking to relieve it somewhere else, and then it's just a catalyst event that, yeah, just is the society we're in today. You can see it everywhere.
Yeah, thank you, folks. And I think to me, it's really clear that we cannot separate sex and relationships education from talking about gender stereotypes. Like, it needs to be included in that conversation, because again, that knock-on effect of, well, I'm relieving the pressure with like someone else is going to keep happening unless we address these underlying issues. And I'm always like shocked when I tell young people, it's like, if you're having sex with someone, they should want to have sex with you back. Like, that seems like a really obvious statement, but when we're not talking about pleasure, we're not talking about, it's something that's taken from a woman that a guy gives, and like it should be mutual. And I think that's part of the conversation. So I quite like that, at least in the Love Bites program, we're able to include that discussion around gender stereotypes. So before we get into the next question, I want to remind people, please keep popping questions to the chat. I know we've got a couple coming through and they are fantastic. So thank you. But what do we like about what we're seeing in consent education? What do we want to keep seeing? Are there things that we like, things that we think could be improved? Yeah, we know that young people should be part of co-designing these solutions. So what do we want to see? Ollie and Ruben, you are currently overhauling Love Bites, and I'd love to hear about if you can provide some secret squirrel answers of what it's going to look like, what the updates you're making. That I'd be interested. I'm sure everyone would love to know as well.
Would you like to start, Ollie?
Yeah, I suppose I'll start, then I'll pass to you. Without giving too much away, our secret ingredient. No, just joking. Look, I think one thing that's really important is that this respectful relationship education needs to be culturally appropriate, and that's something that we're revisiting in our new Love Bites adaptations, all for First Nations people and culturally and linguistically and religiously diverse. So that is really fundamental to respectful relationships education, because I think we talk about a holistic approach that, to be frank, isn't like effective, because we live in a multicultural society. So we can't do a one size fits all when we're delivering these message in school to kids, and then a kid goes home to a completely different culture, expectations, religion. And one of our more senior members in the NAPCAN Youth Speak Out Council is Zara Al-Hilali, who is the CEO of Oak Tree and an amazing Muslim advocate. And she speaks to this point really well. And I'll quote her. She says, having people who identify with these respective demographics lead the conversation is important. We shift language quickly to ensure communities are engaging. There are words in our language that we use to ensure we take a soft and more appropriate approach to sex education. She also speaks to the point that taking a Western perspective and jabbing it into, like, let's say, a Muslim community can be dangerous. And that's why we need to be having conversations with parents, which can be difficult, but bringing the parents along with us and the children. And I think that's why NAPCAN's call for a summit is so important, because we can work with the sector, but we can also work with people in the community. Let's ask parents what they need from us so that we can be bringing them along the ride, and then also asking kids what they need from us. So when they go home from receiving sex and consent and relationship education in school, they can be receiving a very similar message at home that continues to reinforce and break down these barriers and stereotypes. So I think, our new Love Bites overhaul is much more inclusive and takes a very more like culturally sensitive approach, as well as a queer one as well. But Ruben, as a member, maybe you wanna.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. I think you kind of captured a lot of what I wanted to say there. So I'll just say that we have a group of diverse, kind, thoughtful young people who get to make comments and suggestions for adjustment about the respectful relationships education of tomorrow for our future adults. A group who are now in school who will hopefully feel that with the new Love Bites overhaul, that their respectful relationships education is more suited to them and more applicable to their lived experience and living experiences. And I think that's pretty awesome. But I do want to talk about just really quickly about the cultural sensitivity and inclusivity of the new Love Bites program. Another part of my sex ed and completely missing consent and respectful relationships ed that felt really lacking was that I also didn't feel represented as an Aboriginal kid at all. And I think it's important for sexual health educators, respectful relationships educators across all levels to keep in mind that school as an institution often reflects colonial values and beliefs, and therefore can already be disconnecting to our communities and kids. So I think it would be really great if, as NISO are doing, as Love Bites are doing, if we can try and recognise potential white bias in lesson plans. And what would be even better, and again, this is what NISO is doing, obviously outside the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members as well, but collaboration with First Nations staff members and young people in a co-designing fashion. Thinking about what's going to keep our kids engaged, what's going to keep our kids informed, what's going to keep our kids safe. I was reading a 2021 South Australian Commissioner for Children and Young People report that showed that Aboriginal kids in the classroom are far more likely than their non-Aboriginal peers to rate the quality and relevance of their sex education as poor, with additionally far lower levels of distrust in teachers and classrooms, which comes back to my point of school as being a colonial institution. Most of the time, let's recognise our histories. Let's recognise that much of the cisgender and heterosexual dominance, the dominance of binary and rigidity that we see so frequently in Western knowledge systems, doesn't often align with our cultures. Let's create a sex, consent, and respectful relationships education that is reflective of such diversity. And I'm really proud to say that I feel as though Love Bites is doing that with the help of NISO. I think this is going to be so much better for all, really, even for non-Aboriginal students, for white students, for all students. And it's been a real privilege to be involved with NISO in overhauling Love Bites. And it's been really encouraging to see such a big player like NAPCAN not only include young people in the process, but actively and consistently support us and provide us with opportunities in all aspects to have our voices heard and our opinions stated. And it's just really comforting and heartwarming to know that there will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids who hopefully feel more seen and heard and included than I did in school. And I think that's the power of NISO. As I said before, we have such a diverse, kind and thoughtful group of young people who are making real change with the help of NAPCAN and Love Bites. So yeah, I think it's really promising work, and hopefully it spreads far and wide in the years to come.
Thanks, Ruben. Chanel, I'd love to know about the resources. Obviously, you've just got some amazing funding to create some social media resources. What gaps are you looking to fill, and what I mean, you've done some amazing stuff already. What are you proud of? What are you like filling in the space, and what do we need more of, I guess?
So I loved Ruben's answer just then, because it's just so such a topic in the space that is so seldom spoken about, but we also really can't split like the whole idea of invasion and colonization, and that just the fact that our country was built as it is today on these ideas of asserting power and power structures, and also the types of abuse and assaults that Indigenous children experience. Invasion is what formed this whole country, and the way that, also getting into too much detail here, but I did my dissertation on this, that the school system in Australia as we know it today is a colonial import from the United Kingdom, where the schools basically like fostered this idea of like toxic masculinity, and like especially amongst what was originally only boys who could go to school, suppressing emotions and, you know, being removed from parents at a young age and all that sort of thing. So just that, and then to answer your question, Libby, yeah, so very excited. We have $3.5 million to do a social media campaign. We haven't actually received the funds yet because government and bureaucracy, so we're still volunteer run for the moment, so it's going to be a crazy transition, but part of the funding includes establishing a youth advisory committee to help direct and give input to and formulate our work, which I think is so important because, as I said, even though everyone who volunteers and works at Teachers Consent is a young person, they're still not, like, they're not in school. They're not the ones who's receiving this education anymore, and things change so quickly. We need to keep up to date and understand what's happening in real time. And there are so many gaps that need to be filled. And I guess the lane that we're going to try stay in a very specific way is this idea of kind of like culture and getting this education to people without them even almost realizing that it's education. So again, the amount of screen time that young people have these days, when you're like mindlessly scrolling through TikTok or Instagram, how can we just get that messaging just like popping up on their feeds as if it's just part of culture, that consent, affirmative consent, respect, warning signs of coercive control, how to speak to your friends about these sort of topics, all these sort of things are just there, commonplace on their screens, not just what happens to them in their classroom, not making them think that, you know, like, oh, this is a conversation mom and dad are going to make me have, and this is so embarrassing and awkward and like whatever. But basically, we're going to try and make consent cool, I guess, is the like absolute how I can synthesize the point the most. And yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what comes of that. But the gap that we're also feeling is that, so I'm so proud of the tens of thousands of Australians that were involved in getting consent education mandated in Australia. But Australia only has a national curriculum that goes until year 10. And year 11 and 12 is when that's when young people are most sexually active. And the fact that for most schools, absolutely no consent or sexuality education is given in those years unless they opt into it, I think is an abomination. So again, we're trying to fill that gap of ensuring that this education continues beyond the years of year 10. When we're speaking to 16-plus-year-olds, we can be much more explicit in the type of content that's going on.
Yeah, I would actually like to add to Chanel's part of just like that social media education that seems almost just like the norm. Something similar that NAPCAN and the NAPCAN You Speak Out Council are doing is we've created this untaught education Instagram account where we can just post reels and videos of us chatting about, you know, Pride Month or, you know, youth homelessness. What is that looking like? Why do we have, you know, almost 18,000 young people under the age of 12 living on the streets? How many of us know that, you know, like, and what's leading a young person to that experience, you know? And what does that then lead on to? That's going to be a catalyst into youth crime. Let's not go on harder punishments for youth crime. Let's address the drivers that are leading young people to committing those crimes. So just that kind of like education with this broad consensus of respect. You know, there's a driver for most things happening. So just educating people on, you know, respectful relationships, whether it's sex education or, you know, child maltreatment and domestic violence. But that's all I have to add on to Chanel's part. I think that's a big gap. That's that general information about child maltreatment and child abuse and the catalyst events that happen after.
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. And I think like there's lots of areas for expansion. And I love, Chanel, that you're like the learning by almost osmosis of like it's just on social media. I know where Love Right Central Coast is pretty proud of our TikTok, which is like young people creating videos for young people. Like that they're then coming across their food and they're going, oh, actually, like that's a really interesting point. But I think also something that I'd like to see, and we're privileged to be able to go into not only schools, but in community organisations. Coast Shelter is a domestic violence and homeless prevention service, so we're able to run this for young people as well. But making sure that our young people that are no longer in school, that have fallen out of the school system, that are now with disability service providers or that are in like job and recruitment centres, they still get that education, because we are not going to break this cycle if we only educate people that are in that formal education space. Like if someone's away that day, they're never getting that again. And I love that you're looking at year 11 and 12 again, because it's like, okay, well, it's like, oh, they've got it before, like they've set them up. You don't need to touch it again. No, we need to keep going with the conversation. We know that people learn best and it's embedded well when these conversations are repeated, when they're repeated in school, at home, in other spaces. So I guess my advice would be to people listening today, if you are an organisation that works with young people, is there space for you to provide this education? If you are jobs or skills providers, can you incorporate a Love Bites element or a just any sort of respect for relationships education alongside your current program? I think that's needed. I think there's other things we need to include, which we've already touched on. Pleasure, pornography, we need to have conversations about these. Queer relationships, image-based abuse is one of those things that it's talked about with a scare tactic. It's don't do this, this is a law, and it's continuing that shame cycle. So we need to be really, really realistic about young people and meeting them where they're at and answering their questions without shame. We've already touched a little bit on how do we want to do this? How do we want to create that change? I wondered if anyone else wanted to add anything on that before we start talking about perhaps how we have this conversation with parents and then move into some questions. So how do we create change? I know we've started on it. Does anyone want to continue that discussion?
I just want to say that like the recent Australian Child Maltreatment Study by Ben Matthews and Professor Daniel Higgins shows us there has been a decrease in physical and sexual abuse in certain areas, like amongst families. So I just want to put that forward, that change is possible. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, but prevention is so hard, like, no, we can see that change is possible. It's there in the data. We can also see that there's very high rates of abuse. So we need to be acting now. Prevention, sure, we might see a shift in a decade, but there is no time to wait in terms of how quickly and fast we need to be acting. And I think education is a very key way of prevention. It's a good way forward to be able to deliver these messages to young people, but also society. I'm not sure if anyone else has any like top tips on prevention.
I also want to say that so the most recent ANRO's attitude survey unfortunately found that as a country we have regressed in so many different aspects of understanding and attitudes and beliefs around violence against women and children. However, the one area that we did improve in is understandings of consent, and I think that we can't discredit the conversation that has been going on over the last few years due to high-profile allegations about sexual violence. Grace Tame being Australian of the Year, also the Teachers Consent Campaign, so walkouts in South Australia organised by school students, government petitions kind of going on in different states and territories, harmonisation of consent laws, all of these sort of things. And I think that when we're thinking about prevention, it is so that study that Ollie just mentioned by Ben Matthews and I'm sorry, I forgot the other person. Yeah, was incredible, and it found that a lot of sexual violence experienced by children is perpetrated by other children. And I think when we're thinking about prevention, we have to remember that the vast majority of sexual violence, especially in under 18-year-olds, is preventable because it is perpetrated out of ignorance, out of a lack of education, and out of a behavior that is deemed culturally normal by their environment, by the media, by the things around them. So when we're talking about prevention, we're talking about cultural change, and we're not talking about changing the small percentage of people that perpetrate harm intentionally and maliciously on other people and children specifically. We're talking about the majority of people who are doing this because the behavior is seen as normal and okay to them. So I know we've emphasized this a few times, but again, like pornography, even things that are seen in media. And the thing is, I think for like parents and educators, it kind of sounds like this is like one big scary conversation that has to be like done once and then it's done. But in reality, you should bring up these conversations any opportunity that you can get. So if, for example, in school, we did atonement in our English text in year 11, and I have no idea why there was never a conversation about sexual violence or about rape, and that pretty much any textbook, any English text ever will be able to draw on themes of gender and power imbalances. Like, it doesn't need to be explicitly talking about abuse or consent in any way. Same with TV shows when you're watching with your parents. Like, so easy for a scene to come up and it's a simple throwaway comment to be like, oh, they didn't consent to that, or oh, that's not healthy, or like that's a problematic joke. Just all these kind of like little things add to a cultural change that teaches young people what is okay and what's not okay as we're shaping those for them.
Ruben, did you have any thoughts before I launch into mine?
Literally not at all. I covered everything. I just am loving listening to you guys.
Ollie, you looked like you were wanting to jump in there. Did you have anything else to add?
I thought I had a thought and then it just went through my head. But
That's right.
just what Chanel was saying, like the education and the conversation, it doesn't have to be difficult. It just needs to be constant, reinforcing, like the perfect example, what Chanel was saying, just when you're watching TV and just not, instead of laughing at this misogynistic joke, just call it out. It's not even, it's in front of your child or your parent. It's not even in a group of your boys. That's when it becomes really scary. Just be like, oh mom, that wasn't funny. I don't know why you laughed, or vice versa. This is where we'll see the changes.
Yeah.
Also, in the context of the idea of listening to young people as well, I think that there's also so much space to say, like, what do you think about that? Or like, what are your ideas on that? Because I think also, again, sometimes we can expect the worst and be so pleasantly surprised. Like, I remember speaking to my younger cousin about like respect and like women, and he's not that young anymore, but he was a young boy at the time, and I was just blown away by how well equipped he was to have these conversations and how adamant he was to stand up and like want to do better and all these sort of things. And like, I learned things from him in that conversation, and I think that we also really need to normalize parents hearing what their kids are saying about things, because also so often parents or educators or whatever can very unintentionally be perpetuating a culture that does normalize sexual violence, that is victim blaming, that does put shame around these sort of acts. So being willing to reflect and learn from younger people what they're kind of like saying is what they feel comfortable with people laughing at or not laughing at, or referencing, or any of those sort of things as well.
Exactly. I think it goes to like one of the activities that Love Bites has. It's like, where is your line? Like, everyone's line is going to be somewhere different depending on who you are and like your culture and all of that stuff. So yeah, one thing that you might find funny might not necessarily be funny to someone else. So you need to acknowledge that, instead of just dismissing it.
Yeah, I think that that activity is super powerful. And I think to the question of how do we do this, how do we actually give consent education, it's put that power back into young people's hands. It's like asking that question of, oh, is it okay to know where your partner is all the time? And some people are like, oh, well, my partner tracks me on Live 360, and that is so normal now. It's just this culture of it's so normal to know where your partner is all the time. But rather than me going, oh, I don't know how we feel about that, other people in the class can go, oh, well, if you're just at school, or if you're going to the doctors, do they need to know? And where is your line? And that, like Chanel said, that you can be pleasantly surprised when that's when the culture shift happens, rather than me saying, oh, that's not okay. It's them educating each other, going, actually, no, I'm going to make my point. And other people go, oh, I've just been following along with this, and what we call in Love Bite unwritten rules that are assumed in society of, okay, well, guys always have to take the lead during sex, or and have to know what to do every time, or we don't need to ask guys for consent. So all of these cultural norms we can start to shift when through these activities. So I know that we've been talking about overhauling Love Bites, but I think the way that Love Bites is done is really fantastic, in that it's like the youth-led discussions and activities, and channeling those cultural normalities. I also think a lot of what we've talked about there is a part of Consent Lab's Classify Consent campaign. I think they're doing some amazing work on, when you see a TV show that's there's no consent there, actually going, oh yes, calling that out. So if you're interested in more of how to have those discussions, they've got some fantastic work around that. I think also when it comes to how do we do this, make it practical, hands-on, fun. If you're a teacher watching today, wondering how you could do this in your classroom, make it interesting. Ask your young people, how would you like to learn about this? They don't want to just copy things down from the board. I love the on the line, moving around the room. We, at the end of the day, create artworks. I'm not sure. Oh, I've got some right here. The I said stop. We've just got some fantastic artworks that young people create, so that they can cement their knowledge at the end of the day, and have a space to debrief. But there's so many fantastic ways that we can do this. But I want to switch over to the audience questions, because I know that we're running out of time, which is actually something we've touched on again. How do we get older generations on board? How do we get parents, teachers on board, so that children and young people getting access to the information they need? And I think as well, and I know Ollie, you were really keen to talk about this, how do we make sure that parents are educated when a lot of them would not have received this education to start with in the first place from their own schools? So maybe Ollie, I'll throw to you, and then we'll pass around talking about parents.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, because I think, having the message delivered at school is really fundamental, but it's not going to work unless there's a united and unified message also being reinforced at home. It's really hard when you are going home to a completely opposite message. But I really think, just like we speak about us asking young people what they need from us, or what we want to be like, how we can be helped, and how do we feel safe and educated, same goes with parents. I mean, let's speak to parents, because they have the lived experience in their own way. So sit down with parents, have conversations with parents. How can we best help bring you along with this new and scary world that we're easing into, that's changing faster than ever for the better? But we have all of this technology facilitated abuse. It's online bullying, all this stuff that's going on that wasn't a thing probably for our parents. But yeah, same as what we're asking for, we can give them the same space, because I think it's worth hearing how we can best engage with them before we make any assumptions. Does that make sense?
And I also think that sometimes it's about having the tough conversations. I remember a few months ago at a family breakfast, there was my nan, my mum, and my older cousin. And we all had just a really open discussion about the sex education that we received in school. And it did gradually get better, but my nan didn't receive a sex education. The extent of my mum's sex education was putting a condom on a banana. And my cousin's sex education was also really lacking. And then there was me, who had the best experience of sex education out of everybody. But as we heard before, that was still pretty shocking. And having that kind of conversation kind of evoked a mutual understanding that we had all been failed by the education system, and that leaving school, none of us felt as though we had the knowledges that we should have had about sex, about consent, about respectful relationships, and the consequences that that has had throughout all of our interactions going forward. And so rather than having this narrative about kids are too young to talk about this, or kids aren't equipped to deal with this, going, actually, we owe this to our kids. And, you know, that conversation was really important in my family, at least, because now my 70-year-old grandmother is like, I want better for our kids. I don't want, you know, our kids of tomorrow to be having to deal with what I dealt with or what my youngest grandchild, Ruben, dealt with. And so maybe about shifting perspective of it, because obviously it's really helpful and integral that this is taught at school, but we also know that so much learning happens at home, and that so many knowledges are reinforced at home. And so, as it was mentioned before, having those conversations or making those comments when something icky happens on the TV, when something bad, something non-consensual happens on the TV, when there's a misogynistic joke, it's really important, because that also teaches young people in another institution, hey, this is wrong, and this isn't okay, and maybe I shouldn't do that, and maybe if I see that, I should be pulling that up and I should be questioning that.
Chanel, did you want to jump in?
I agree with everything you guys say.
I was just going to say, also reflecting and saying, okay, maybe I haven't been best in my past because I too missed out on all of this education, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that I can't move forward in better and stronger strides. You know, like I look back on some things that I did and like texted when I was younger and think that was horrible of me. I would never do that now. And I would be willing to own up to those mistakes and take accountability. And I think that's where it comes from. Take accountability of your actions and just know that you can move forward in a better stride. One of my colleagues says, you don't need to get it. Like, you don't need to always fully understand it, okay, as a parent, but you just need to support that this is the world that we live in now, and that all of our experiences are so vastly different.
Yeah. I also think that I think that there's lots of hesitancy to engage in these conversations if people think that they're going to say something that's wrong. And I think that it doesn't, as you said, it doesn't necessarily need to be 100% right or perfect, just like starting point and having them. I guess another thing I would say to parents as well, in terms of, I guess I'm coming from a space of talking about like consent and sexual violence specifically, but thinking about how you're engaging with media in front of your children. So, you know, these topics are often in the news, and like your commentary on that, you very well may directly be speaking to your children, who is, you know, they could be a potential victim of sexual assault or a already victim of sexual assault. They could be a potential perpetrator of sexual assault or already perpetrator of sexual assault. So what messaging are you giving them, commenting on some other person's case that you think is like completely removed? And like, I mean, we all know what it's like to be watching the TV with your family. Everyone's like completely honest and candid and can be absolutely brutal about things, and they give their like complete honest opinion on things. But thinking about what that opinion that you're giving is telling your children, and if that makes them feel safe to come forth about their own experience. So I remember really clearly the same time I got a consent talk when I was in year 10, same time that I was kind of like going through the realization that something that happened to me that when I was 13 was non-consensual and an act of sexual assault, was the same time. She was still anonymous at the time, but Saxon Mullins was in the paper, and Luke Lazarus, and that court case in New South Wales, that was like it was kind of everywhere, and it started lots of conversations. And hearing my parents and my community as well, because I'm not religious, but I'm technically part of the same church that Luke Lazarus, the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator's family, was from, and hearing those conversations going on in the community sent like a strong message to 15-year-old me to not say anything, because it would not end well for me if I did, because this is what the people around me thought about these sort of things. And again, that just goes back to that topic around shame, and we need to kind of shift the shame from victim survivors to perpetrators, essentially.
I think that example of like modeling that behavior is super important. Modeling consent behavior to your kids is a fantastic way to start. We have conversations in the classroom and say, if you're going to post a photo of your friends, ask them beforehand. You know who doesn't do that? Parents on Facebook. So sorry if I'm calling you out in the audience, but actually engaging with your kids. Hey, do you want this photo to be online? Thinking about their digital footprint, thinking about their consent around their body. Because otherwise, when you're not doing that, it's like, it doesn't matter how you like to portray yourself to the world, that you as a parent get to dictate that. And that's a really simple way of starting those discussions around consent. Also, really reading Dr. Melissa Kang and Yumi Sines' books, things like that are fantastic. Play Safe is a website that you can go to as well, family planning. You go to Love Bites website, you can go to Untaught Education, you can go to Teach Us Consent and have that education through online platforms as well. But I think there's some fantastic ways to start. I know we've got other questions coming through, but I want to make sure that we all have time to like get our last thoughts through on what people really want to see. So I think or do we want to answer one more question? Ollie, you've got thoughts. I can tell you're jumping at the bit.
I just
and
say I just
book.
want to the list that you were just listing, eSafety. I mean, we've touched on image-based abuse here, but I think eSafety is an amazing organization that is often missed. We have heard of really sad stories where, you know, an image has gotten out about someone and it's been the catalyst for their suicide. And that could have been prevented potentially, given that these parents and the police had known that eSafety existed and they could have taken that image down within 24 hours. So I just want to reinforce that if you didn't know about eSafety, like, this is one organization that you should definitely be aware of, particularly in today's age. And yeah, just reinforcing just education. I mean, Chanel's just got a book coming out. If you're not across consent and you're a big bookworm, give it a go.
Yeah, thanks for yeah, and thanks for adding eSafety in there as well, Chanel. Sorry, yeah.
I was also just going to say, I think a great part about eSafety is also that young people can go to it without telling their parents or teachers or police. And I think that it's a really strong resource to let your children know about, and that they can let their friends know about, and all that sort of thing. Because sometimes, you know, it is embarrassing if, you know, there's a naked photo of you that you don't want on the internet. And being able to get that removed from someone who can actually remove it and do something about it without having to go through a police process or have conversations with teachers or parents can be really helpful. So definitely something to share with your children.
Yeah, thank you. And I know I wasn't aware of eSafety when that happened to me, and I'm so grateful now that I am able to educate young people on it. And I think to that point, I would love to wrap up this talk by talking about, like, we have these discussions and I feel really moved as an audience member, and I go, what can I practically do? Like, what are the takeaways? How can I make change? So I've got thoughts, but I think I'll summarize it all. So we'll pass to Ruben. Are you able to give me some hard hitting, what do you want people to walk away knowing for me?
Look, it seems simple, but just the value of having young people in these conversations. I feel really lucky and grateful to have been here today, but this extends beyond us. It extends to so many areas of everyday life. I guess just when in positions of power and making decisions about young people or for young people, asking yourself, have I consulted with young people about this? What would young people think about this? Is this applicable? And I guess that goes for any position, you know, when your work and knowledge impacts a group of people, consider next, have I consulted with this group of people? So I think that's probably the one overarching key thing that I'd like people to take away from today. And coming back to that, nothing about us without us. Programs, advice, knowledges can be made so much better, so much more impactful, so much more applicable and suitable if you just consult with us and value our voices. So yeah, that's probably what I want people to take away today.
I would say my like a tangible action to take away from this is to go and have a conversation about child protection, about consent, about education. Find out from a young person in your life what's missing from their education. See if you can fill that gap for them. See what sort of research you have to do yourself before filling that gap for them, or in how you can use that information with other people. But yeah, I mean, we've had like 450 people join this webinar today, and if every single one of those people had a conversation with a young person about a topic that impacts young people's safety, that would have a massive effect.
I suppose I would say that, just to reinforce the point and messages that we deliver at NAPCAN, but that this is a community issue, and that, you know, society will not shift until we all realize we're accountable for making change and for shifting the stereotypes. So just, you know, be conscious of the views that you're putting out there, and questioning yourself every now and again about whether that is a helpful view to have, or whether it's damaging a particular part of society, a particular group of people. Yeah, and just realizing that, you know, all of these things, respectful relationships, education, consent, child maltreatment, they're all things that we can improve on, and that prevention is possible.
Thanks, everyone. There's some fantastic takeaways. I would say, as adults listening, if you've got young people in your life and you're worried to have these conversations because you yourself haven't experienced them, as Ellie said, give it a go anyway. Educate yourself, read the books that you're planning to give to your children, and educate yourself first as well. Take yourself along that journey. You can learn together. That can be really powerful as well. If you're interested, I know there was a couple comments about how we get regional communities involved, and I think that's super important. Love Bites training, you can be trained to deliver it in your own community, whether you're a teacher, a social worker, a mental health professional, anyone like that. So jump on NAPCAN's website, find more about that. If you're a service that engages with young people, can you be having conversations about respectful relationships? Can you integrate that into your programs? And lots of people asking how they can support and follow up. We will have all the links in the chat to support all the organisations mentioned today, obviously NAPCAN and NISO, and then Chanel Contos Teach Us Consent. Go buy Chanel's Contos's book on the 12th, Consent Label. I feel like I'm plugging you away now. Yeah, you can follow Love Bite Central Coast on our socials as well. So that's the wrap up today, but I want to thank everyone for their time today. Thank you, panelists, for being here. Thank you, audience, for tuning in. It's amazing that so many people are registered in here. This is not the end of the conversation. As we've said today, we need to keep having these conversations in order to make sure that our young people in our communities are protected. The recording of this webinar will be posted onto the website and email to those that have registered. We'll have all the links to the things we've mentioned today there as well. There's a short survey that's going to go up at the end of this, so please take your time to give us feedback and say something nice about the fellow panelists here, okay? We'd really appreciate some nice comments about Ollie, Ruben and Chanel, and we'd love to know what you enjoyed, what you want to see more of, so we can make sure next year we do bigger and better. And there's another webinar today, and there's webinars tomorrow, so it's not too late to sign up for more. And if you missed any from earlier this week, you can find them later. Please continue to share information about the week, and you can visit more information at napcan.org.au. But thank you again. We're finishing right on time, 2 minutes early. Amazing. Yeah, thanks for joining us today.
And thanks, Libby, for facilitating.